Have you ever wondered what happens when obsession becomes a shackle for the mind, capable of transforming even the simplest of creatures? What leads someone to lose their very essence, plunging into an abyss of insatiable desire? Prepare to unravel the fascinating and disturbing journey of a consumed mind, a story that will change how you view the fragility of the human psyche and the dangers of clinging to something in an unhealthy way, revealing the depths of psychological corruption. In a distant time, beneath the innocent glow of a gentle sun and the soft breeze that blew over the green hills, lived Sméagol, a creature of the hobbit kind, simple, until then, harmless. He dwelled by the banks of a crystal-clear river, where life flowed at a peaceful and unassuming pace, much like that of many others in his community. Days passed in harmony with nature, engaging in daily activities such as fishing, exploring the banks, and enjoying the tranquility of the environment. Innocence and a certain naivety were the hallmarks of his existence, without grand ambitions or complex desires, just the pursuit of a simple and uneventful life. However, the seed of his transformation was planted in a moment of curiosity and a discovery that would turn his world upside down, forever altering the course of his life. While fishing with his friend, Sméagol, in the river's depths, Sméagol found something gleaming on the riverbed. A ring. It was no ordinary ring. Its beauty was mesmerizing, its shimmer irresistible, and an aura of power and mystery seemed to emanate from it, instantly and overwhelmingly capturing Sméagol's attention. From the first touch, a strange and powerful sense of possession and an overwhelming desire began to sprout in his mind, like a rapidly rooting weed that chokes everything around it. Psychologically, Sméagol experienced what we might call immediate positive reinforcement and an intense activation of the brain's reward system. The object's uniqueness, the sense of power and exclusivity it seemed to bestow, awakened an intense pleasure and instant gratification he had never felt before. This initial contact triggered a primal impulse for appropriation, a craving that began to override any social, moral ties, or even the deepest friendship. That object, seemingly harmless in its form, began to become the center of his universe, the sole focus of his attention, and the source of a new and dangerous meaning for his existence. The simplicity of his life quickly vanished, replaced by a single overwhelming focus: the ring. This initial attachment, almost childish in its intensity, already signaled a trait of vulnerability to temptation and instant gratification, a fertile ground for what was to come. The seed of obsession had been planted, and its roots began to deepen into Sméagol's psyche, undermining his essence. But something no one saw coming, a darkness preparing to engulf his light, transforming him into something unrecognizable. The moment of rupture for Sméagol was not a single isolated event, but a series of choices driven by that alluring object, the One Ring, which already exerted a growing dominion over his mind. The immediate and most brutal trigger was the confrontation with his friend Sméagol over possession of the artifact. Sméagol's refusal to surrender the object, which he had legitimately found first, unleashed an uncontrollable burst of fury in Sméagol, an outburst of rage that culminated in an impulsive and violent act, the slaying of his own friend. There, on the riverbanks, Sméagol's innocence was irreparably shattered, and the first major moral barrier was crossed. He did not hesitate to commit an extreme act, an act of physical and fatal aggression, to secure possession of his precious, demonstrating an alarming prioritization over human life and any emotional ties. From that moment on, Sméagol's transformation began to accelerate dramatically, like a rapidly progressing disease consuming its host. He became reclusive, paranoid, and his family, horrified by his actions and the radical, frightening change in his behavior, repudiated him and expelled him from their community. Exiled and isolated, Sméagol retreated from sunlight, social interaction, and any vestige of his former life, seeking refuge in the dark, damp depths of a cave. The physical darkness surrounding him mirrored the darkness beginning to consume his soul, a self-imposed isolation that fueled his growing pathology and further estranged him from humanity. Psychology can explain this transformation through the concept of depersonalization and dehumanization, as well as the intensification of a schizoid or schizotypal personality disorder, where social isolation, loss of connection to reality, and the development of bizarre beliefs become prominent. The ring was not just an object of desire. It began to mold Sméagol's identity, becoming an extension of his own being, a parasite feeding on his essence. Each day, his old personality faded, giving way to a new persona obsessed, distorted, and profoundly lonely. Social exclusion intensified this process, reinforcing the idea that the ring was his only companion, his sole source of comfort, power, and meaning. The internal conflict between what he was and what he was becoming was agonizing, manifested in murmurs and dialogues with himself, a reflection of his fragmented mind. But the ring's allure was too powerful to resist, acting like an addiction that suppresses reason and morality. This reclusion and symbiotic relationship with the ring led to a profound alteration in his perception of reality and himself. He began to mumble to himself, developing two voices in his mind, one still resembling Sméagol, the innocent being, and the other, the voice of Gollum, representing the ring's corrupting and malevolent influence, a reflection of his fragmented self and the internal battle he waged. And it was there that everything began to crumble, paving the way for complete submission to the darkness and the total loss of his humanity. In the dark, damp depths of the cave, far from any light or human warmth, Sméagol's distorted mind was irrevocably shaped, giving rise to the figure of Gollum. The physical darkness and profound loneliness, combined with the constant, corrosive influence of the One Ring, transformed his psyche into a labyrinth of obsession, paranoia, and a completely new, monstrous identity. He was no longer Sméagol, the hobbit. Now, he was Gollum, and his new way of thinking, moving, and interacting with the world was revealed in every gesture, every hoarse whisper, every furtive, creeping movement. His eyes, once filled with innocent curiosity and the light of innocence, became large, bulging, adapted to perpetual darkness, and permanently fixed in an expression of insatiable desire or constant fear. His skin, once healthy and earthy-toned, was now pale, clammy, and covered in sores and lesions, adapted to the absence of light and life in the caves, a physical reflection of his internal deterioration. But the most significant change occurred in his mind and voice. He began to refer to the ring as "my precious," a morbid possessiveness that became the compass of his existence, the sole reason for his survival and the source of his identity. We can understand this phase through the lens of the psychology of addiction and the formation of a pathological identity that overtakes the original. Gollum exhibits all the signs of severe dependence, a compulsive need to possess and interact with the ring, a loss of control over his own behavior, and persistence in seeking the object of his obsession, even in the face of extreme negative consequences and self-destruction. The ring acted like a psychotropic drug, altering his brain chemistry, reconfiguring its reward circuits, and absolutely dominating his will. His mind was constantly searching for that distorted pleasure and sense of power that only the ring could provide, becoming a mental slavery from which he could not escape. Phrases like, "We hates them," "Thieves," "The little thief," "Baggins," "We hates them forever," reveal the projection of his own guilt, anger, and insecurity onto others, a primitive defense mechanism to justify his own cruelty, possessiveness, and isolated existence. Paranoia became a central and defining characteristic of his personality, believing that everyone wanted to steal his precious, a manifestation of his own diseased mind and the ring's influence, which whispered suspicion and malice. This evolution from Sméagol to Gollum is a vivid example of how obsession can structure an entire personality, distorting values, perceptions, the capacity for love and trust, and the very essence of a being. Darkness did not consume him. He became darkness itself, shaped by an insatiable desire that transformed him into a creature of pure need. But the true monster, in its cruelest, most manipulative, and treacherous form, was still dormant, awaiting the right moment to fully manifest and claim what it believed to be its rightful possession. The point of no return for Gollum was his complete and irrevocable submission to the ring, which became not only his object of desire, but his very identity, his reason for being, the sole compass in his twisted universe. Every act of betrayal, every whispered lie, every guttural and possessive murmur of Precious cemented his irreversible descent into an abyss of depravity and dehumanization. He no longer cared about the consequences of his actions, no matter how nefarious, as long as they brought him closer to his treasure. His worldview became singularly focused on the ring, and everything else was merely an obstacle to be overcome, a tool to be used, or an enemy to be eliminated in his incessant and sickly quest. Morality and ethics became strange and irrelevant concepts to him, replaced by a distorted logic where the supreme good, the only truth, was the possession of the ring. His rationalizations were simple and brutal, devoid of any nuance. It's ours, yes, ours, and they want to steal it from us. He believed, with unwavering conviction, that the entire world was against him, and that his inalienable right, his manifest destiny, was to possess the precious and protect it at all costs. This perspective placed him in a disturbing dilemma for the external observer. What if, in his diseased and distorted mind, he was right? What if obsession was an extreme form of love, where the beloved object becomes the sole reason for living, justifying any means to achieve and maintain it? Total transgression manifested in his willingness to lead Frodo and Sam to the brink of destruction, guiding them through perilous paths, deadly traps, and treacherous ravines in the hope of reclaiming the ring. Compassion, gratitude, and loyalty, feelings he might once have known in his life as Sméagol, were swept away by the overwhelming tide of obsession. He did not see Frodo as a friend or benefactor, despite the kindness and mercy offered to him. He saw him only as a temporary guardian of his precious, an obstacle to be overcome and, if necessary, eliminated. This stage of Gollum exemplifies the complete inversion of values, where individual desire and pathological compulsion override any social or moral norms, or even the instinct for self-preservation. He did not act out of pure malice in the sense of gratuitous cruelty, but out of a compulsion so overwhelming that it became his sole motivation, his only law, his only purpose. The question that lingers is terrifying and deeply disturbing. To what extent can obsession dehumanize someone, transforming them into a mere vessel of unrelentless desire, capable of any act, however heinous, to satisfy it? The line between victim and villain becomes thin, and Gollum's tragedy reaches its climax. Delving into the psychological analysis, Gollum's behavior, however bizarre, repulsive, and seemingly irrational, makes sense within the logic of pathological dependence and obsessive-compulsive disorder in its most extreme and destructive form. The ring was not merely a material object. It became the focus of an overwhelming compulsion, a fixation that dominated Gollum's every thought, emotion, and action, redefining his existence. His entire life revolved around the possession and protection of his precious, a downward spiral of compulsive behavior. His internal duality, expressed in the voices of Sméagol and Gollum vying for space in his mind, can be interpreted as a dissociative identity disorder or a profound ego fragmentation, where the personality divided and deteriorated under the weight of initial trauma and the prolonged, corrupting influence of the ring. Sméagol's voice represents the remnant of his old innocence, a part of his being that still fought for redemption and a return to the light, waging a losing battle against the dominant persona of Gollum, who embodies obsession, paranoia, and darkness. This internal struggle is what makes him so fascinating and tragically human, as we see glimpses of the creature he once was, in contrast to the monster he became, a being divided in his very essence. Studies on addiction and the neuroscience of dependence show that the relentless pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of withdrawal can lead to irrational, self-destructive, and even criminal behaviors, where logic is subjugated by need. Gollum, over centuries of isolation and a symbiotic relationship with the ring, developed such deep tolerance and dependence on the artifact that its removal caused an unbearable withdrawal syndrome, manifested by his despair, uncontrollable fury, and a frantic, incessant search for the lost object. The momentary satisfaction of possessing the ring outweighed any pain, suffering, or harm he might inflict upon himself or others, demonstrating the absolute priority of his compulsion. The ring filled an existential void, becoming the sole source of meaning, purpose, and identity in his life. Comparisons can be drawn to real cases of compulsive hoarders who develop an irrational and unhealthy attachment to objects, or to individuals suffering from severe addictions, where their entire life revolves around the substance or addictive behavior, neglecting all other areas of life and destroying relationships. Gollum's logic is the logic of the addict. Every action, no matter how cruel, treacherous, or self-destructive, is justified if it leads to the object of his obsession. He was not mad in the sense of chaotic and purposeless insanity. It was cold calculation, but a distorted calculation, shaped and driven by an overwhelming and pathological need that redefined his existence and transformed him into a creature of pure obsession. What remains after the destruction caused by Gollum's obsession is a complex legacy of pain, betrayal, and, ironically, the salvation of a world. His unyielding compulsion for the ring, which led him to a life of misery, isolation, and depravity, was ultimately what resulted in the destruction of the object that consumed him so utterly and threatened all of Middle-earth. His final fall into Mount Doom, at the peak of his insane and fleeting joy upon momentarily reclaiming his precious, was the tragic and poetic climax of his journey, an end that sealed the fate of many and brought an age of darkness to a close. Gollum's story shapes the world around him in several ways, both for the characters involved and for the very universe of Middle-earth. For Frodo and Sam, he was a reluctant guide, a constant burden, and a vivid reminder of the insidious dangers of obsession and the importance of compassion, even for those who seem beyond redemption. Gollum's presence tested Frodo's resilience, kindness, and moral strength, showing him the darker side of the ring's influence and the fragility of the human mind. For the destiny of Middle-earth, his obsession was the unexpected catalyst for victory, proving that even the darkest and most corrupted creatures can play a crucial and involuntary role in the grand scheme of things, becoming an instrument of fate, even without intent. We can draw a profound philosophical and moral reflection from his story. Who are we to judge a creature so utterly consumed by an external force? Although his actions were horrific and his choices condemnable, Gollum was, ultimately, a victim of an overwhelming and corrupting force that transcended his own will and transformed him into a slave. He is a mirror of human fragility in the face of temptation and the way obsession can corrode the soul, distorting the perception of reality, the capacity for love, and the freedom to make choices. His story forces us to confront the question of the extent to which we are responsible for our actions when our minds are so profoundly altered by an addiction. The cycle of corruption and destruction, initiated with the discovery of the ring, ends with Gollum's fall and with it, the destruction of the precious, freeing the world from its malevolent influence. But the reflection on the power of obsession, the human capacity to be consumed by an insatiable desire, and the thin line between victim and villain still resonates. His story remains a cautionary tale, a reminder that darkness can manifest in unexpected ways, and that the fight against one's own inner demons is, at times, the hardest of all. But perhaps he was not the last to succumb to such a fascination, and the seed of obsession might yet find new ground to sprout in unsuspecting hearts. Sméagol's journey, the hobbit who became Gollum, offers us a disturbing and fascinating window into the abysses of the human mind, revealing how obsession can disintegrate a soul, corrupt the essence of a being, and, paradoxically, shape the destiny of an entire world. His story is a somber and poignant reminder that true horror resides not only in external monsters and tangible threats, but in the insidious capacity of our own desires to devour us from within, transforming us into what we fear most. Gollum is not merely a villain, but a distorted mirror of the human condition, a warning about the psyche's fragility and the overwhelming force of addiction. What truly differentiates us from Gollum when the temptation of our precious becomes unbearable? And how far are we willing to go to satisfy a consuming desire, sacrificing everything we are and everyone we love? A deep and disturbing reflection on the nature of addiction, the soul's fragility, and the eternal battle between light and darkness within each of us.